Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Max Odkins with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program here at CAL FIRE, and I'm excited to welcome you to this presentation highlighting research from one of our grantees in the Forest Health Research Program. We're joined today by Dr. Susan Prichard from the University of Washington for this presentation, the Western Klamath Reburn Project, Evaluating Pathways for the Ecocultural Restoration of Fire in the Western Klamath Mountains. Today's presentation is part of our Forest Health Research Program, which is funded in part by California Climate Investments, which puts cap and trade dollars to work in communities throughout California. This program aims to prioritize and fund research in forest health and fire science critical to the state of California, share scientific information, and support statewide plans, including the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. We do offer competitive grants on a typically yearly basis, and to date we've funded 114 competitive research grants for a total of about $34 million. You can find out more about the Forest Health Research Program at the link that's posted on this slide or using the QR code that is located at the bottom of the slide. Before we get started, I do have a little bit of housekeeping for anyone who hasn't been to one of these presentations before. This presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our website at the URL that's located on this slide, and you can also find that using the QR code on the slide. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so for anyone who has questions, please go ahead and enter them in the meeting chat at any point, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. You can also use the raise hand feature, and if you do so, we'll go ahead and during that Q&A session allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Susan Prichard is a fire ecologist at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Her main interests are in the effects of fire and other disturbances on forest dynamics and landscape strategies to mitigate future fire severity and smoke. She is focused on applied research questions that help to inform adaptive stewardship under climate change, including innovative approaches to wildland fuel characterization and fire modeling. Thank you so much for joining us today, Susan. We're very happy to have you here. Please take it away.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to hopefully quickly launch my PowerPoint presentation. Third time's a charm. So, Max, does that look good?
Yes, looks great.
Excellent, great. Well, it's great to join all of you today. This has honestly been one of the most meaningful projects I've had in my career. I was just mentioning to Max at the start of the presentation, or before everyone joined, that when I was in college, we read a book called The Klamath Knot. I'm not sure if any of you have, but for me, it introduced me to just the astounding biodiversity in this region. But the Klamath Knot, even though it talked about the mysteries involved in how diverse this region is, glossed over the ever important influence of Indigenous stewardship. So in this project, we're really happy, just honored to be working with the Karuk Tribe in the overall design and questions that we're asking of a pretty complicated model. So bear with me in some of these slides because we're going to dig into this model, but the questions really have to do with ecocultural stewardship, fire stewardship, and bringing fire back on this landscape. So our research partners are the Practicing Pikyov Committee of Karuk DNR. These include Shay Burke, Asia Conrad, Colleen Roger, and then Bill Tripp, Kathy McCovey, and Frank Lake are very involved as well. And so Frank Lake is actually our science advisor as well as a PI on this project. I wanted to mention that the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council has been incredibly helpful in partnering on funding for this study as well. Through a contract with us. And then finally, Skye Greenler, you might have heard of her, did her PhD dissertation on cultural burning, and we are grateful for her work and also putting it to good use in this project. So within our Practicing Pikyov agreement, we recognize that this landscape that I'm talking about today is a cultural landscape. The data for this project are collected on Karuk land, and Karuk land and data sovereignty are integral to not only this project. We're really working on a very respectful engagement with the tribe, but also to the restoration of fire in the Klamath Mountains. So I'm going to zoom out and just talk about Western United States and say something that we all know very well, which is that historically, especially in the interior West and throughout California, fires historically were numerous and tended to be pretty self-limiting. And so this awesome illustration by Miriam Laurel is supposed to be kind of a time elapse with historical ignitions and mosaics shown at the top panel, an era of fire exclusion and active fire suppression in the mid panel that allowed for dominance of conifer forests throughout much of the interior West, as well as the Klamath region. And then an era of really large and severe wildfires, which we've been all living through and breathing. So one of the things that we're interested in this project is just a multiple analysis of the risks of continuing with a business as usual scenario, and also an alternative future that mirrors the past in which cultural burning really maintained mosaics and more resilient landscapes. So some of the risks that we're interested in evaluating with the Reburn model are about landscape resilience. There's been a lot of community impacts and losses from these fires, negative impacts to culturally important plants, wildlife habitat, and materials. There's just a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions from our current scenarios, impacts to water quality, loss of legacy trees, just mature and old trees are blipping off these landscapes. And then we often don't necessarily think about this year after year of putting out fires, but it really leads us to our most uncertain of futures with boom and bust wildfires. So that was really an inspiration to our first effort on the Reburn project, which was conducted in North Central Washington State. I decided it would be helpful to kind of show a few slides on that project just to let you know where we're heading rapidly with the Western Klamath project. So over here in North Central Washington State, our landscape is right up here. And the panel I'm showing is just quite a bit of fire over the last 20 years. You'll notice that a lot on the western side is forested and burning at pretty high severity, moderate and high severity. In the Western Klamaths, it's pretty striking that a lot of the fires also share that kind of stamp of a lot of red on this severity map. So yes, there's definitely a mix of severities, but these wildfires that are occurring are definitely outside of historic norms in terms of the size and severity of these fires. So I wanted to mention that today, one of our co-Is, Frank Lake, is actually working as a cultural resource advisor on this fire, which was originally called the Butler Fire and is now the Orleans Complex Fire, about 20,000 acres near the community of Orleans, where KDNR is based. And you'll see that it's just burning in a lot of reburns. So we are working on a simulation effort while fires are actually working on their own version of reburning in these landscapes right now. So I wanted to give a quick overview of what Reburn's about. And you'll see in a slide coming up a workflow that's much more complicated. And so I figured that I'd kind of like ease into the complicated versions. So Reburn was developed basically to iterate on an annual basis wildfire seasons, igniting fires in a wildfire season, and then stepping forward with changed vegetation from those wildfire impacts, and then also fuel succession when wildfires don't occur. And so it allows us to simulate landscape fire and vegetation dynamics over time using state and transition models that basically step forward annually fuel accumulation, both on understory and surface fuels, as well as canopy fuels. And then we have a fire growth model that basically models fire at an annual time. So the annual time step is basically we have a wildfire season, we allow lightning ignitions and human ignitions to burn, and then we have a stage where we update all the pixels in our simulation landscape to represent post-fire as well as just fuel succession on an annual basis, and then we do it all over again. This scenario process has really been so instructive. We've learned a lot about it, and we're now ready to take some calibrated models and examine 21st century climate change and implications of warmer and drier conditions, and potentially more lightning in some areas. So some of the areas that we've studied so far are the tripod landscape was here. I'll give you a few more results on it. We stepped that landscape right up north of the border to British Columbia because of the state and transition models were so similar. We could bring it north to evaluate a scenario in Canada. And then the Western Klamath has been just an enormous challenge to parameterize the model, especially in such a diverse landscape. So some of the things that I've already mentioned are evaluating historical fires. So what created landscape resilience in the past. I didn't mention yet that hardwoods are really key interest to us. So this is why we moved our modeling up into British Columbia, because aspen plays so much more of a role there than in our original landscape in the tripod. And we're really interested in thinking about the role of sprouting hardwoods and how they may play into resilience into the future. And of course, in the Western Klamath, hardwoods are also foods, medicines, and culture. So we'll get into that soon. I mentioned future climate. And then key to all of this is how do we move to better forest stewardship in these areas than we're doing currently? So the tripod complex was inspired, the tripod study was inspired by the tripod complex. It burned in 2006. I studied a lot on field treatment effectiveness. And one of the things that we really noticed is past prescribed burns were often just barriers to fire spread. There were these funny green islands in the midst of a sea of really otherwise high severity fire. And so that was really instrumental for me doing a lot of field treatment effectiveness in this landscape. And then we started zooming out and just seeing how past recent fires, like the 2003 Isabel fire here and Farewell fire, were just absolute barriers to fire spread as well in this event. And then a 1994 Thunder Mountain fire did reburn a little bit, but it still really changed the course of where this fire was able to move. So for a time, we've noticed in north central Washington that past fires, past prescribed burns are complete barriers to spread, and then they are receptive to burning, but that burn is very different just because it doesn't tend to be as severe the next time around. So this is a little overwhelming, but I couldn't figure out a better way to present results. And so I just wanted to show you that, we run this model year after year for literally thousands of years and look at the patterns of fire over time. And what we decided to do in this paper to introduce the model is show some time steps of, this is actually well into after the spin up of the model and the fire and fire interactions have really gotten going in this landscape. I decided to show the model results at here's a 25-year increment, and then 50 years, and then 75 years, just to show you some patterns of how the vegetation structure changes over time. So a primer on this is that dark colors represent old forest. So the dark green and dark blue are old forest. Black is a recent burn, so that's kind of a post-fire bare ground. It can have forest overstory, but it just represents an area that has burned, whether it's a stand replacing fire or an underburn. And then pink represents young forests. Yellow represents regenerating forest, stem exclusion, closed canopy. And then again, darker colors are older. So what I wanted to kind of point out here is that these landscape patterns just keep on moving over place and time. We were fascinated to see how old forests take a walk. They're not stationary. There's not a huge evidence of a lot of refugia in these landscapes, but rather old forests burn and then they're taken away, and then like grow, and then they burn and taken away, and then they grow again. So over time, there is old forest habitat, but it's in smaller pocket. When we take fire out of the system, it only takes about 60 years to go from a highly pixelated type of example here to much more of a continuous forest. And so we actually know that the tripod fire burned under a long absence of fire. And so it looked much more like this, with young forest multi-story in green and old forest multi-story in blue. And it had pretty kind of like uniform effects of fire behavior. This diagram comes, or figure comes, from Nick Povak's sister paper in the same release of our tripod study for the Reburn. And what it's basically showing is a superposed epoch analysis of, here's a fire event, and then on average over a lot of fires and a lot of time, what happens with crown fire probability. And you can see that for over 15 years, crown fire probability is reduced. Fire corridors, at first they're reduced. And so this is where we're talking about how past fires remain as a barrier for a time, and then they gradually become receptive again to fire. And then fire fences here, this is kind of showing the inverse too, which is that there's a strong increase in areas that just cannot carry fire. And then that effect gradually reduces over time as fuels accumulate, whether they're live grasses or dead litter. So wanted to show you some pictures because that was kind of heavy on the figures there. So what we've been noticing is that following fire for a time, there's not a lot of fuel buildup, but then the reason why fire fences break down is that after especially a first entry fire, a lot of the antecedent trees fall down and can definitely carry fire again. And so what this is showing is heavy fuels following a high severity fire. And then this right here is showing following a high intensity reburn of all of that downed wood. And so it can have really interesting effect where you no longer have antecedent wood on the ground. And this area can remain a barrier for longer just because there's not all that down wood from that second fire. Another fire feedback that we were definitely aware of when we were doing the tripod model is just underburning of forests basically gradually shifts timber litter fuels, especially when forests are open and their canopies allow a lot more light into the understories, to more of a grassland understory. And so we are noticing that for a time after fire, there may not be enough fuels to carry another fire. But then under this scenario where there's plenty of light in the understory environment, grasses can burn, but interestingly, they have a season. So in the spring, there's green up right now in this picture where fuels are not very receptive to burn. And that's interesting because timber litter is dominated by down dead fuel and has a much longer season of being receptive to burning than these grasses do. So in terms of fences, I also wanted to point out that sometimes fences can be seasonal fences and then shift to corridors. And then finally, a really important feedback that we're noticing in North Central Washington, and certainly exists in the Western Klamath too, is this is after a high severity fire and flammable shrublands come back, especially after the second fire. In some areas where shrubs can thrive, they can really get going and outcompete conifers in some cases. So just quickly with the BC region, one of the things that we've been really fascinated by is looking at a landscape that has aspen in it, which also, when it's young, can act as a barrier to fire. And so this is work that Jocelyn Laflamme is doing for dissertation work at UBC Okanagan. And it's just basically stepping through incremental change and showing you once again that fires are able to burn, but the the dark is recently burned, and then the light is where forest is regenerating. And so the landscape ends up with all of these kind of fences limiting the size of fire, which is kind of the point of this diagram. But we've been noticing from the tripod landscape as well as the BC study that if about 40% of the landscape hasn't been in recent burn, again, that might just be an underburn of a forest. It tends to be limiting of fire sites, and you don't get those really large events. So quickly, some of the key questions for our Western Klamath project then are, how can we imagine a different way that fire could return to Western Klamath? Right now, this area is getting kind of pummeled by these large, high-severity fire events to some extent. I am simplifying because when you're out there, you can see that there's actually a lot of mixed severity fire too. But in general, we're not seeing a landscape that is constrained by past fires, except for very large-scale patchworks. So we were hoping to use the Reburn modeling framework to explore ways to move from these kind of big boom and bust landscapes to ones that are maintained by finer grain mosaics that ideally are more adapted to climate. And within this really important landscape, we're interested in bringing in culturally important material culture, basically. So foods, fiber, and medicine into how we evaluate outcomes from fire. I'll get into that with our state transition models. We've carefully reviewed the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan and are going to be linking our states within the state transition models to keystone indicator species. We also have the ability, because we're looking at fuels that can burn in wildfires, to do a pretty good job on estimating smoke production and impacts to air quality, translating fuels to actually wildlife habitat and plant habitat, and then thinking about carbon storage and sequestration. So we're kind of set up to do a really kind of big trade-off analysis. I have riverine systems and salmon in here, but that is really not something that we're capable of really evaluating in this study, but are hoping to partner with other researchers on that topic. So I mentioned the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan. It's a really amazing document. I think I have a link to it in the very next slide. But basically, it highlights the importance of the Karuk Tribe and other tribes in the region being able to practice their cultural stewardship. It's a key part of being adaptive and promoting adaptive stewardship over time, learning while doing. Culturally valued species are really keystone to the plan. But the plan also mentions smoke and air quality, and certainly mentions salmon and riparian systems. I mentioned here also that Skye Greenler devoted a chapter of her work to this paper. I have a link to it, and it's an excellent read if you haven't gotten to it yet, which is on blending Indigenous and Western science, quantifying cultural burning impacts in the Karuk Aboriginal territory. So this work certainly follows up on that. I mentioned the Klamath Knot at the beginning. My gosh, this Klamath study area is so diverse. And so I wanted to introduce to you, this is again from the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan, just the many zones within in this landscape. It's highly rugged. It's just so incredibly steep. So the low elevation forests are characterized by mixed evergreen forests, definitely a lot of Douglas fir. In the past, historically, with a lot of cultural burning, black oak, live oak, and tan oak, black oak and tan oak especially were dominant. Then this mid-elevation zone has a localized inversion, which has a lot to do with when and where fires are allowed to burn. It also tends to moderate temperatures for part of the year. Sugar pine and bear grass grow in this zone, and it's very important. Culturally important species. And then the high elevation is actually above that inversion row and tends to get fires more regularly in the summer than actually this inversion zone. And so these species up here are white fir and red fir, and again, bear grass is important. I mentioned smoke. There's a very cool study that partners with Indigenous knowledge keepers on how cultural burning can interact with that inversion zone and actually contribute to cooler river temperatures and protect salmon in the later season. So when we're thinking about this study area, we think through not only how diverse the plants are in this region, but also that we think about how fire and airflow definitely move through this rugged topography and interact. Our study is also very much relevant to the Good Fire 2 report produced by the Karuk Tribe. This Good Fire 2 report is really advocating for removing barriers to expanding cultural burning. So our study is very much in support of Indigenous-led fire management, and I think we will definitely be able to examine the continued consequences of fire suppression and think through fire as more of an ecocultural process. So I'm not sure how many of you have been able to drive through this later fire, but it's astounding in the area. And I just wanted to kind of show you a picture of one of the recent fires. Not all of the fires in the Klamath look like this, but this one in particular burned severely. And one of the things that was kind of jaw-dropping about it is that conifers are going to have a long time to reestablish. This will be a landscape of shrubs and hardwoods for some time. We've also been able to witness some of the cultural burning. I was able to take part of one of the Karuk Indigenous Women's Treks events. And then here is a cultural burn near Orleans in 2003, just to show you a picture of it. So now we're going to move into more of a modeling framework, and I hope to keep your attention on this, but I wanted to bring you back to this idea that Reburn works by modeling a fire season and then iteratively growing fuels and responding to fire year after year in the model. So I will spare you many minutes on this slide, but I wanted to quickly say that when I talk about iterating through fire season ignitions, I think I'm going to start right here. We've decided to use a program that's a fire simulation tool called FS Pro that's part of the wildfire decision support system. And it basically makes use of a landscape file that has canopy fuels and surface fire behavior models as an input to each pixel in the landscape. And so we bring that landscape file in along with digital topography. And then we bring in ignition probabilities. And so for our first attempts, it's been on lightning ignitions, and now we're moving into cultural ignitions. But during the fire season, we model given drawn weather and ignitions, fires throughout the summer fire season. And so that then produces flame lengths that are then converted into severity classes. And so we know for each pixel basically how severely it burned and what likelihood, if there were trees in that pixel, what likelihood they actually were killed by the fire or were spared by the fire. So once that fire season is all done through as many ignitions that are drawn for that fire season, we then go through a process of updating each of the pixels that burned to represent a different state. So that's now a burned pixel, and it will go through time as such. And then any state IDs here, the green that didn't burn, have to grow 1 year older in terms of a forest or a shrubland, and also accumulate fuels. So in a way, each year we have a lack of fire is also really a pronounced change in that fuel bed over time. And so following this over, we then begin it all over again with the kind of non-fire succession transitions. We've updated the fire pixels, and we're ready to go with a new landscape and model a new season. For the Klamath region, this will be very interesting, and we're just now able to start on the fire modeling. It's taken us a long time to parameterize the model, but we have ignition surfaces from lightning density. And I wanted to point out something to you, that this is what the tripod probability looks like. So just really high probability of lightning strikes up on the ridge tops and much lower in these valleys right here. Whereas in the Somes Bar landscape of the Western Klamath, we have some higher probability of lightning up in the mountains here, but very low overall. And so what this says to us is that if we tried to just use lightning, we'd get it so wrong for this landscape. We know that from fire scar records, which show that fires have historically burned, and this is a conservative estimate because it comes from fire scarred trees, every 8 to 15 years. And so based on definitely oral tradition and some on fire scar records and lake sediment records, we know that this area historically had just a huge amount of cultural burning. Sky Greenler's dissertation provides us with basically some frequency, size, and timing distributions that we can use as a first cut on these simulations. And so basically, we know that cultural ignitions, for instance, are very frequent near the main stem of the Klamath River, and then get less frequent beyond. So we'll move into a little bit more of that later. We needed to build a pathway group map. So basically, this is the type of pixels across our study area. And so what this shows is that the light green and dark green are the mixed evergreen forest dominated by tan oak and black oak and Douglas fir. The blue is a lower montane zone dominated by white fir and Douglas fir, with some tan oak. And then the red zone is upper montane, which is dominated by white fir and red fir, as well as chaparral fields in the pink. The state transition models are incredibly complicated to talk about and have taken us a huge amount of time in consult with a lot of people to build. And I just wanted to say that basically each pixel that is red in our pathway group map maps to a state transition model. And so if we were to zoom into a single pixel here, over time, it could actually be any one of these states. So had there been a really high severity fire, it would be state 1A. And then in the absence of fire, it would come over to state 7A. So I'll just kind of unpack that a little bit more with photos because it's easier. So here we're showing a state 1A as post-fire bare ground after an absence of fire. And we know there's been an absence of fire because trees are pretty dense here. And you can see that this was killed by fire. And then over time, there will be basically stand initiation of regenerating conifers, but with some slash on the ground. And then stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, a young forest with multi-stories, and finally an old forest with multi-story. These photos might not look exactly like the Klamath region. These are actually taken from the north central Washington, but are meant to represent kind of a spruce fir forest to show you what fire exclusion looks like in an upper elevation. Now for reburning, what happens if we have a high severity burn right here at 1A, and then forests are regenerating with all the slash on the ground from trees falling down, and then you get a short interval fire happening. In the Klamath, that actually is really going to bring you into a flammable shrubland. And so here we're just showing a transition from state 2A with all that fuel on the ground into more of a persistent shrubland for a while. Over time, that shrubland can be invaded by conifers, overtopped by hardwoods if you're in the lower elevation, and come back into forest. So I also wanted to say that the state transition models each one of them is parametered. Each box on the model is parameterized with what we need for modeling fire. And so here we're showing kind of just these funny diagrams of stand initiation, stem exclusion up to old forest multi-story. And those are then translated into basically, they're given a structure class, which is what I just described. They have a surface fuel model, so a fire behavior fuel model, and then they have canopy parameters. All of that is then used to evaluate fire behavior. We also, I'm going to do this in different slides, can translate each state into other metrics that are really useful. So I feel kind of sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to just show you that the dry mixed evergreen pathway is enormously complex and also kind of fun. So imagine like you are in 1 pixel near the Klamath River, so low elevation, and it's definitely capable of being a forest. But that pixel can also be a prairie state if it's burned enough. And so coastal prairies in this area are definitely still present, but used to be much more common under indigenous burning. And so our model allows for a way for many, many fires to erode a forest and actually maintain non-forest through a prairie. I will spare you too much of this, but basically what I wanted to share is that these pathways allow for no fire, so the black arrows, and then they allow for light fire, which are green arrows, and then moderate severity changes the forest canopy. We assume 50% of the canopy is killed by moderate severity fire. And red arrows, we assume that over 70% of the canopy is killed by fire. So very complicated. What was super challenging for us within this region was not hard to imagine how oak forests gradually became conifer forests through invasion and fire exclusion, but how, when we're in more of a fire excluded landscape, how do you actually move with fire to get back to oak forest? We could talk about that in the discussion period, but this has been really complicated and also so rewarding to think through how fire pathways can get you there. So each of those states that I mentioned can also represent and can and should represent vegetation. And so we are right now linking those states to what they're capable of supporting. And so these cultural keystone species here are listed by elevation zone. And I wanted to mention here that these oak woodlands are black oak dominated for the dry mixed evergreen pathway. And so we can kind of think through then the associated plant species and even wildlife species, and definitely basket weaving materials and other material culture that are supported by fire maintained oak forests and oak woodlands. So moving into that, here are just kind of some pictures of many different culturally important species that are listed in the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan. What I wanted to highlight in this presentation pretty quickly is just black oak, but I also wanted to mention that tan oak is incredibly important. So there's a wonderful book called Salmon and Acorns Feed My People, and I'd highly recommend it. And it definitely talks about how even though salmon are a really important food source for Karuk, acorns are a staple. And so tan oak acorns are really important. And then black oak holds a lot of significance as well. So if we were to take a walk through the forest right now, I could definitely remember some places where cultural burning has been practiced to restore some of these tan oak and black oak woodlands to their former vitality. This work comes through a lot of patient burning to make these trees more resilient to wildfires and also give them a little bit more elbow room. And my gosh, they do not have a lot of elbow room right now. Douglas fir, as much as I love that tree, you tend to not love it so much when you see how it's overtopping some of these magnificent black oaks, and that the black oaks have been hanging on for decades and may not make it if they're not given more room to grow soon. Here are just a few other pictures of showing how some of these trees have been allowed to grow in the open. Black oak, I think this might actually be live oak right here. But if this were black oak or tan oak, some of the lower branches show that there have been more open grown in the past and are getting more closed in. Here's a madrone, just showing a lot of neighbors and its phenomenal ability to resprout if given fire and room to grow. I wish that Jesse Thorson were here to give the next slides. Jesse worked with Meg Krawchuk and the Karuk Tribe on her master's thesis out of Oregon State University, looking at ecocultural stewardship and revitalization of black oak. And so these slides are thanks to her. She now works with me in the Flame Lab. And so one of these slides here is just showing how black oak woodlands have been encroached by here very young Douglas fir and are getting kind of spindly and definitely do not have great acorns. Here is a lovely diagram illustrated by Steve Ordling showing much broader canopies in an open. So high acorn production would be capable over here on the right, and then here is not a resilient state for black oak. Jesse has a paper that was recently published in Earth Stewardship, which is a new ESA journal, on monitoring of black oak to center indigenous ecocultural revitalization. This diagram that she created is really thinking about not just individual oak trees, but that oak can be represented or fostered by cultural fire regime over a broader area. So this robust cultural landscape and fire regime supports food, fiber, and medicine. And again, here's Reburn, supports some natural fuel breaks. So it both is a fuel as well as source of material culture. So cultural values are centered on this to facilitate stewardship practices that then foster these resilient landscapes. So these black oaks that we have in our state transition models are one species, but can also then really represent the habitat that would benefit multiple species. California hazel is such an important plant, and not only important for wildlife species, but also has hazelnuts as well as basketry materials if maintained by cultural fire. Jesse's slide also just shows that when black oak woodlands are open and maintained by regular fire, they can support an incredible number of foods and medicines and materials. So here we're showing some of the lilies, so the ground potatoes that are such important staple food, acorns, huckleberry, Albert green huckleberry, fungi, basketry within this state. So we're pretty excited that each of our states can then be a launch point if the Karuk tribe wishes to think about if we can get to a state, then that could be a safer launch point for practicing our stewardship and promoting all of these important values. So right now we're in the middle of developing our scenarios and running the Reburn model very soon. And so I just wanted to give you some of our goals. So I think I've already mentioned that it's such an opportunity to represent ecocultural systems. If we just did lightning, we'd be missing most of it. Once calibrated, the modeling scenarios will allow us to examine opportunities to restore traditional fire regimes and the keystone species and habitats that they support. We will start with very general scenarios and then work with the Karuk tribe if they wanted to eventually be able to run their own scenarios that maybe they hold within their own culture. Each state within these pathways can be attributed. I already kind of touched on that. So our scenario development is going to be business as usual. So moderate fire suppression, we're seeing that play out right now on the landscapes pretty well. A lightning only scenario is interesting just so that we can see the paucity of fire and then the ability for forests to grow quite a while before the next fire. So we anticipate that the lightning only will be kind of these bigger fires with time between them. And then cultural burning scenarios will be many fires in many places through respectful engagement on these scenarios. So some of the questions we're asking of the cultural burning scenarios are, what are the indicators of the need for place-based burning? For instance, right here, we're seeing a tan oak woodland that is in pretty good shape to do regular burning, but other states will perhaps need some forest thinning before they could be burned, for example. How can scenarios be developed to support continuity of valued resources? So can burning be staged to ensure that foods, fibers, and medicines are broadly available in the study area landscape? And then I've mentioned this before, but this is definitely going to be work that goes beyond this grant through active engagement with the Karuk Tribe. For our trade-off analysis, we're actually getting really close to being able to run these because each state in the state and transition lookup tables already supports canopy fuels, surface fuels, and then the vegetation and fuel characteristics are being populated right now to support FCCS fuel beds that can be used to estimate total above ground biomass, carbon, and run emission scenarios. So for trade-off analysis, it will be very interesting, and I hope very useful to be able to think through scenarios that might maximize carbon and biomass, but in the end be quite hazardous in terms of wildfire and also cultural resources. So for next steps, we're developing the scenarios and running the models, so stay tuned. I'm going to do several acknowledgements. Some of these are repeat from our partners. So the practicing Pikyov committee members, Karuk DNR, Beltrip has offered his time and wisdom so graciously. Sky Greenler, Bob Gray was right there with us when we started the whole Reburn modeling saga. Frank Lake, and finally, the Mid-Klamath Restoration Council. We're very fortunate to have this funding, and I'm excited to share with you today. Great, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan. We're going to transition into a Q&A in just a moment, but I just want to have everyone join me one more time in thanking Dr. Prichard for coming in and joining us here and sharing this excellent research. It's really exciting to see what you've been up to in the Klamath, and yeah, very excited to get into the discussion here. We've already got some in the chat.
Excellent.
So with that, I will go ahead and end our recording and we'll transition over.